If you had to pick between fishing a river or a lake, which one would you choose? Rivers can seem intimidating, but once you understand how to read them and what the river is telling you, it's actually fairly simple to fish, and it is easy to identify places where trout are likely to hold. But then you go to a lake and it's like you're starting all over from ground zero again. You look around, it's like being in a bathtub. It's like, where are the fish? Why are they there? What flies do I use? Do I even have any of the right flies at all to tackle this? Well, lakes feel tough and they seem tough because they are different. But once you understand those differences, you'll actually end up putting fish in the net in no time. On today's episode of Untangled, I'm going to share some simple tips to help you master fly fishing on lakes. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Company. Welcome to it, thrill seekers, conversationalists, music lovers all across the fruited plain. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durrant. Excited as always to be here with you behind the microphone. It is it's starting to look like winter outside here in Wyoming now, so I'm actually really happy to be in here where it's a little bit warmer. And I'm really excited to get the chance to talk fly fishing with everybody this week. We're going to be diving into a whole bunch of different topics. Specifically, we're going to get into some basic streamer tips, how to know if you're using enough weight with your nymph rigs, how to identify trout, how to find quality flies, some rigs for smallmouth bass, and how to properly store your gear. Oh, and we're also going to talk about how to fly fish in alpine lakes for trout. So we've got a lot to talk about this week, and I just want to jump right into it with some short questions. And we're doing 4 short questions this week. I got so many good ones, and these all just kind of fit. So we're going to do a couple more short questions than we usually do at the beginning of the show. And I do just want to take this minute and remind y'all that there is no question too small or insignificant to be answered about fly fishing. If you've got a question about fly fishing at all, just please go ahead and submit that question. There's always a link in the podcast description. I will do my best to get that answered in a timely manner on the show. I think I'm starting to get caught up on my backlog of questions here. So if you have submitted a question, I promise I'm working my way through them. I will get to them, I promise. All right, our first short question comes to us today. Steven from Oregon writes in, says, first, thank you and the whole team. Your videos and podcasts are relevant and informative. So the question is, when should I move to streamers? What kind of conditions would you look for? And what are the basic techniques and presentations? Thank you. Hey, Steven, thank you for that question. We actually just did an entire episode about streamers. I've linked that in the podcast description for you, but it is episode 38. So you can go back and listen through that to get the really in-depth answers. But I still want to answer your question here a little bit. Generally speaking, you can use streamers whenever you want. There is no switch that flips and then, no, I'm going to tie on a streamer. That's not how that works. You tie them on just about whenever. They are really effective, though, during high water or when the water is a bit off color, or right now, it's fall. It's October right now as I'm recording this, and the trout are packing on the pounds before winter. They're getting very aggressive during the spawn. So streamers are a very effective fly to use right now. And then again in the spring, things warm up, and before the bugs start hatching, but the fish are kind of waking back up from winter, they'll want to hit streamers a lot then as well. So you can see them on a little bit of a time crunch there as well. I really do like using streamers on bigger tailwaters. As far as presentations and techniques, though, you often are going to present them on the swing with a quartering cast or dead drifting under an indicator. We got into all of those in detail during that episode 38 that I mentioned, so you can definitely find more about it there. But what I would like to drive home here is just think of streamers as another tool in your toolbox, the same way that we think of nymphs and dry flies. Sometimes your best bet to put a big fish in the net is going to be using a streamer. So thank you for that question, Stephen. I appreciate it. Our next one, Steve from California writes in, says, how do you know if you have enough weight when fishing bottom with indicators or with a Euro rig? Steve, that's a great question. And the answer is thankfully really easy. We don't get a lot of those really easy answers in fly fishing, do we? If you are constantly catching the bottom on each drift, you have too much weight on. If you are never catching the bottom, you don't have enough weight on. You want to catch bottom every few casts or so, and that'll let you know that you're in that sweet spot, right? It's like the perfect wing sauce. You know it once you bite into it. It's like the perfect slice of pizza, right? It's almost hard to say what it's going to be exactly, but as soon as you bite into it, you know, oh, yeah, this is good, right? You're going to have that same realization with your split shot. Okay, maybe not. maybe the food metaphors don't work there that I love so much, but you really are looking for that balance between snagging the bottom of a bunch and never snagging it at all. Of course, there are going to be situations when fish are feeding a little bit higher in the water column, and that's why you're going to want to use a double nymph rig so that you don't just have one nymph on the bottom. You've got two nymphs, so one's on the bottom and one's a little higher in that water column. Thank you, Steve. Appreciate that question. Micah from Idaho writes in. He's got one for us. He says, this may sound like a funny question, but what tips do you have for identifying the different kinds of trout that you catch? I have been fishing most of my life, yet I still have a hard time telling the difference between cutthroat and rainbows. Love the podcast and everything you guys do over there at VFC. Mike, that's not a funny question at all. It's a really good one, and thank you for the kind words. Appreciate it. The whole VFC team loves this. We love what we're doing, so we're just happy to hear from other folks that y'all enjoy it as well. Interesting story about identifying trout. My niece, Bethany, she's a great little girl. And, well, she's not so little anymore. She's in high school. I'm old. Anyways, she and I used to sit with her when she was like 7 or 8. And I have, all these fish pictures on my phone for fish that I've caught. So we'd go through and look at them, and I'd quiz her on which one it was. And she got to the point where she knew them better than most of my fishing buddies. She could tell me what kind of fish I caught. So you could always quiz yourself if you want. I don't know why Bethany loved that so much, but she did, and I'm really happy about it. It was a fun little thing to share. But really, you mentioned the difference between rainbows and cutthroat. Generally speaking, rainbows are going to have a darker green back. They'll have a lot of silver coloration. They also tend to have a lot of spots, and they tend to be evenly distributed, and the spots are usually the same size. I keep using like 10-2 and generally and usually because there is no absolute with rainbows or with any trout for that matter, but these are pretty good rules to stick by. So if you see a fish that looks like that, usually it's going to be a rainbow trout. Now, cutthroat, they have a much browner, almost a darker colored back, and they'll often have fewer spots unless it's a Snake River cutthroat. Then they're going to have a lot of spots. Some Colorados have a lot of spots too, but they're not as all over the body as rainbow trout spots tend to be. And cutthroat are going to have a lot of red and yellow on the gill plate. Rainbows, they'll get red, but it's a different shade of red. Sometimes it's kind of hard to explain. But then, of course, the cutthroat will have the red slashes under their jaws. The dead giveaway, the thing that's easiest for me to identify is rainbows will have white tips on their fins, which cutthroat won't ever have. So if you've caught one and you're not sure what it is, if you look at the fins, there's going to be a white tip on some of them, and that means it's a rainbow or a heavily rainbow cutthroat hybrid. Cutthroat won't have the white tips on those fins. So that's kind of your go-to to make sure you tell the two apart. So interesting question, Mike. I appreciate it. And our last short question for this week's show, and then we'll jump into the main part of it. Alex from North Carolina writes in. It says, when buying flies, how do you know where to find good flies? I shop at Sportsman's Warehouse. Their flies are cheaper than others, but talking to my local fly shop, they say the quality is not as good. What makes the quality different if they're tied with similar materials? And should I buy the better quality fly from my local shop? Alex, this is a little something that we know about here at VFC. We know a little bit about flies. It's kind of in our name, right? Ventures Fly Co. So I think the important thing here to understand, and this goes for everybody, not all fly tying materials are created equal. There is a difference in quality between them. That's something that even before I ever met Alex in Berkeley here at VFC, that's something I stood by as well. And I always bought the highest quality materials I could for my own flies because I wanted them to last longer. I wanted them to look better on the water. So there is a difference. Hackle is a place that you see that very often. You can have a really good or really bad hackle. The bad hackle is a lot longer. It's not as stiff. It's very webby and thick. Here at VFC, we tie our flies with the best hackle that we could find. That's something that we spend a lot of time and money on too. Our hackle is not cheap that we use, and that is one of the biggest things that will make a difference in our fly quality right now. And good flies from bad flies is going to be that hackle quality. If it looks like it's been wrapped on well, and the barbules, so the little pokey parts of the feathers, if they seem stiff and evenly distributed, you've got a pretty good hackle there at that point. The quality also comes into play in both in materials and in how the fly is tied. Cheaper flies are less likely to be tied correctly with maybe the wrong proportions in the body or really cheap thread that will fray after a few fish. Some cheap flies won't even have head cement on them, so they'll fall apart really quick. Head cement's really important to keeping the flies together. Generally, you are going to get a better quality fly at a fly shop than at any big box store. I've worked at a few fly shops, and I've bought a lot of flies from Sportsman's Warehouse. In fact, I think I kept the Sportsman's Warehouse in Provo, Utah, single-handedly in business there for a while with how many I was buying before I started tying a lot. And there is a difference between the two, and it really comes down to material quality at the end of the day. Of course, I'm going to put the flies that we have here at VFC up against any of the flies that are currently on the market. So I suggest looking at what we've got as well. Alex, we've got plenty of great flies. I think we could probably help you out. I put a link to our collections in the podcast description. And that ties it up. That wraps it up for the short questions this week, folks. So do whatever you got to do. Hit pause, go to the bathroom, grab your Diet Coke, grab your goldfish. In fact, I've got a few goldfish here in the studio because I'm apparently still 5 years old and like to snack on them. Alex and Berkeley keep making fun of me for that because they bought me some on a fishing trip earlier this summer. They keep asking me, do you want your goldfish and your juice now? So anyways, let's move on. Get comfortable. That's what I'm trying to say. Get comfortable, get ready, because we're going to move into the main part of this week's show. Jim from Illinois writes in, and his question is, I just started fly fishing a few years ago, and I have a 5-weight rod and 8-weight. What is the best type of fly line to use for smallmouth bass, leader length, and flies? I fish small rivers in northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin. Your podcast has been a great help, and thanks for sharing your experiences and knowledge. Hey, Jim, thank you. Appreciate it. I really do. I'm glad some folks are benefiting from my fishing addiction. So it's funny because now when I go out fishing, sometimes I'll tell myself, well, I'm doing it for the fans, right? I got to go for the fans, or I got to have something. No, I don't say that. I go fishing because I love it. But it is fun to know that y'all enjoy it. I appreciate that. This is a good question, though, Jim. To help get some answers, I asked a buddy of mine. He lives in the South, and he fishes bass a ton. So I wanted his 2 cents because he knows way more about it than I do. I've got a few stories, and I'll share those in a minute. But he really knows a thing or two about bass. So he recommends the Orvis Hydros Pro or the Rio Creek line. He says they're both really good for smallmouth fishing. He does a lot of smallmouth fishing in rivers down there in the South. So sounds like similar stuff to what you're doing where you're at. His leaders vary in length depending on the water clarity and what he's throwing, but he says 10 feet is the longest leader that he's used. All his leader is straight mono. It's not tapered, and it's usually like 8-pound Berkeley trilane line. Now, I thought that was really good to know because my smallmouth fishing, the bulk of my smallmouth experience came from a trip I took to Lake Powell down in southern Utah, which I got a little bone to pick with these national writers because Lake Powell's been in the news a bunch lately, right? About the drawdowns, and it's low, and Mead's low, and the Colorado River's drying up, and they're all writing about it. And they keep talking about how Lake Powell's in Arizona. No, it's freaking not. All right. Utah, it's in Utah. It's part of it's in Arizona, but the majority of the lake is in Utah. So give Utah our credit. All right. That's all I'm asking for. Utah deserves the credit on Lake Powell. Okay. Mini rant over. It's probably not even a big deal, but I've seen it enough from these so-called reporters who should know a thing or two, and they don't, because they're, saying that these lakes belong in different places. I'm not bitter at all, right? Anyways, my experiences down there at Lake Powell, I was on a boat for 3 days with a buddy of mine, and I don't think I changed a fly the whole time. And I was just fishing a little white bunny leech. I think it was a size 10 or 12, so it wasn't very big, on a floating line on a 9-foot tapered leader. And I caught more fish than really I knew what to do with. I caught so many smallmouth. It was just incredible. It was one of the most fantastic experiences I've ever had fishing, because I was so used to trout, so used to rivers, and we go out on this lake and I start throwing this leech all day for smallmouth, and it was just almost nonstop all day long. We were there at a great time of year, and the smallmouth were really active, so that definitely helped out a lot. It was a lot of fun. But that's where the bulk of my smallmouth experience comes from, was sitting on a boat for 3 days and sleeping on the shore of Lake Powell and catching them. So that's why I wanted to pull my buddy in, because he knows way more about the river smallmouth than I do. I would also highly recommend to anybody who is interested in smallmouth, if that's what you want to do, you need to read Dave Whitlock's Stream Smallmouth Bass article in Fly Fisherman magazine. Dave, he passed away earlier this year. He was the absolute best at this stuff. There's nobody that I would rather learn from, spend a day on the water with, than Dave. He's just, you can't do it better, in my opinion. I've linked that article of his in the podcast description, so you can go find out a bunch of stuff about smallmouth there. I'm not going to share everything that Dave wrote, because it's Dave's work, and I don't want to just sit here and regurgitate all of Dave's stuff. But there was one thing that I really wanted to share, a little quote that he wrote out. He said, "Unlike trout, smallmouth don't take flies if the water is colder than about 45 degrees, especially if the water temperature is falling. During these times, I fish for other species." I thought that was a really interesting insight, because trout will eat, year round for you. They'll eat in the winter. Granted, if the water's super cold, they're not going to be very happy about eating, but they'll eat the flies. And it's interesting that smallmouth don't do that. So while there is a lot of crossover between streamer presentations and retrieves and lines between trout and bass, there's enough uniqueness to it that you should definitely read through the stuff that Dave has to say. He is, again, I just can't overstate enough how great Dave's information is on this topic. So definitely go give that a read. And I really appreciate the question, Jim. Thank you so much for sending that one on in. Our next question comes to us from Texas. I got a lot of family in Texas, so it's always fun to hear about Texas again. Anyways, Cameron writes in, says, "Hi, Spencer. I primarily fly fish for bass since I live in Texas, but I still like to head out to the mountains to fish for trout. When I do this, I always hear about fishing alpine lakes, and a common recommendation is using a terrestrial pattern like an ant. This being stillwater, though, I've always wondered what to do once you cast out a dry fly. Do you leave it to sit, or do you strip in line to make it look like a bug moving in water? Or do you throw all this out and tie on a streamer? Thanks for the help." Hey, Cameron, that's a really good question. I was going through the VFC archives, and we actually did a podcast episode about fishing in lakes not too long ago. If I was really good at my job, I would have remembered exactly which episode, and I could tell you. But we went through and did it. Anyways, I do want to dive into it more here, because your question was specifically alpine lakes, so we'll get into that. And I've also written a story for the VFC blog about fly fishing in alpine lakes. I've linked that in the podcast description. So if you want to see the information instead of hear it, and if you need to see some visuals, you can definitely check that out as well. As for your question, the common reason that we get told to use terrestrials on alpine lakes is very similar to why we end up using them on rivers. They are a high protein food source that trout will key in on, and they end up in lakes because they get blown there by the wind. And you've got to remember the growing season in these alpine lakes is so short, so trout tend to be a lot more opportunistic because of that. They will crush flies a lot more. They'll kind of be in more of a feeding frenzy, if we want to use that term. They just really go after big bugs like that. You can certainly add a twitch to it to make it look real, but I've had more success just letting them float for a minute, trying to cast them in front of fish that are cruising the shallows that you can see. But that's why we're told to use grasshoppers or ants up there, because they're such a big ticket meal item for those fish that they'll come, and they're a lot more likely to hit that than they are the caddis or the mayfly. Not that they're not going to hit the caddis or the mayfly, but I think what I was trying to say is the action's going to be more consistent on the terrestrials and maybe the caddis and mayfly, depending on where you're at. Because if it's still too cold for terrestrials to have been blown up there by the wind, then you're probably not going to want to fish them. But they are just a good attractor type bug on that kind of water. Now, your question here, I know it was just kind of about that, but I really do want to dive into this like I teased in the hook for the show today. When we start looking at lakes, I think a lot of us get intimidated, and I know I do. I still do. There's a lot of times, me and Alex were out just, 3-4 weeks ago maybe. Was it that long? Holy crap. 3-4 weeks ago we were out, and we were fishing. We were driving to one place to fish, and we passed a couple lakes on the way, and we got out to look at them. And we didn't see very many fish rise, but we're just taking a look at them, enjoying our time. And I remember feeling like, I'm out of my element here a little bit. So even now, I still feel that way sometimes. I think it's residual frustration from getting my butt kicked on lakes growing up as a kid. But what's really frustrating about lakes is that they're not like rivers where we've got our runs, we've got our seams, we've got our pools, we've got our riffles. These are all telltale signs that show us where fish are likely going to be holding. So we walk into the river already feeling like we've got maybe a little bit of an upper hand, right? We walk in like, yeah, that's right, fish. I know where you're at. I'm going to come for you. Yeah. And there's nothing you can do about it. You can't stop me. And then they refuse your flies and you feel like an idiot and all the confidence goes away. No, hopefully that doesn't happen too often. It happens to me more often than I'd like to admit. Anyways, I want to share some of the things that I've learned and a little bit of info from some experts as well about fishing lakes, just so we can hopefully clear this stuff up and give everybody the knowledge and the ammunition you need to go out there and actually really, really do some work on some lakes. And I know it's October, but if any of the high country lakes around you are still open, you can sneak up to them and maybe get in a little bit of fishing before the snow flies. With the water this cold, it's kind of tough, but it's still worth going up to check them out. Now, like I mentioned, where I've always struggled fishing lakes is knowing where to start. I feel like it's fishing in a bathtub. I look at it and I'm like, where the heck are the fish? Well, the common sentiment among everybody I've ever talked to about this, I've bugged some big-time experts in the field about this, a couple buddies of mine who are just exceptional lake anglers and really know their stuff. The common thread between all of the advice they give me is that you need to look for structure. If you find structure, you're going to find fish. That's the same advice that we're given in a river, but the structure in a lake looks different. And that is really that's where the paradigm shift needs to be. You start looking for different structure when you're on the lake than you do in the river. Now, structure could be submerged logs and boulders, points where the shore juts out into the lake, undercut banks, transitions from deep to shallow water, weed beds, and the shallow water itself could be structure in the loosest sense of the term. If you focus on finding these areas, submerged logs and boulders, points, undercut banks, transitions, weed beds, and shallows, you're going to be a lot more productive because fish are going to use this structure either to hide from predators, or it's a spot to ambush food, or it's a little bit of both, right? The shallows, they're usually cruising to eat. You're not really hidden from predators very well there, but you are filling up on the food. So it's a calculated risk the fish are willing to take. I want to explain a couple of these pieces of structure in depth, though, so we understand why the fish are there and exactly what that piece of structure is. And we need to start with the shallows because this is where it all starts. This is where you get to the lake, and especially the alpine lakes, the shallows is where you want to start looking because that's where you can most easily cast to, but it's also where a lot of fish are very likely going to be. They cruise the shallows of alpine lakes because that's where the majority of the food is in these lakes. The bugs that get blown onto the water are usually there in the shallows. All of the weeds that grow scuds, for example, and midges, or they don't grow them, but they like to live in them. That's all in the shallow. They all got to grow where the sunlight warms the water up the most. Again, that's the shallowest part of the lake. Fish cruise them pretty regularly, so you are going to want to stock the shallows and cast well ahead of cruising trout to try and get them to eat your dry fly or your nymphs. A couple of years ago, I was in the Wind Rivers with a buddy of mine, and we came up to this lake, and we were just walking the shoreline, and you could see a bunch of fish cruising the shallows, and I didn't even have a dry fly on. I just threw a nymph out there and let it sink, and threw it ahead enough of some cruising fish, and they came and smacked it. So that concept does work out there. Now, after shallows, you can start looking for some points. A point is where the shore juts out and creates a point. It's kind of named that way. But it creates this shallow hump where all the fish that are cruising the shallows have to cross it at some point. It is a great place to suspend a chironomid rig, and I will get into the flies and rigs more in just a bit, so hold on for that. Another spot to look for is transitions. Anywhere that there is a distinct transition from shallow to deep water, there's going to be a distinct line, and trout will hold on that line to ambush food, and it also helps them hide from predators a little bit. So it's a good place to strip streamers or to suspend nymphs. And the last spot I want to talk about is the weed beds. If you see a big weed bed, fish like to hang out in them. If there are like little channels or cuts in the weed bed, that's even better because the fish can hide in them and they can ambush big food items that swim by like leeches, but then they can almost filter feed all the scuds and midges that are living in the weeds. There's actually this little lake back in Utah that I used to fish that feels like the whole lake is just weed beds, and there's a few channels in between those weed beds. And I would go out in my float tube with a buddy of mine, and we would position ourselves so we're right over the channel in these weed beds, and you'd sink a little leech down to the bottom, and you'd just strip it along the very edge of the weeds, and these enormous brook trout would just come out and smack that like it stole something from them. They loved hanging out in those little weed beds. So that's a favorite spot of mine, is if I can find a weed bed and I can get on it, I know there's likely going to be some trout hanging out in it. So now that we know where to look to find fish, what flies should we be fishing? That's our next progression here in figuring out alpine lakes. Well, aside from a good stock of dry flies, like you need some caddis, you need some Adams, Griffiths gnats, hoppers, and damselflies, you really need to focus on the nymph game. Midges in particular are going to be money on alpine lakes. A box of chironomids just a larger midge, essentially. A box of chironomids is always going to help you out, and you have to have scuds and leeches. I would not go to an alpine lake without chironomids, scuds, and leeches. Those three flies, I've probably got more fish on alpine lakes on those than anything else. One of my favorite rigs for an alpine lake is I like to put a chironomid about 3 feet above a micro leech, and then I put that all in like a 12-foot leader beneath a slip strike indicator. I do that because it allows me to get the depth that I want, but then when I set the hook, the indicator slips all the way down to that first fly, so I can pull the longer leader through the guides without the indicator slipping up into it. So it's a really nice way to still have a long leader, but not have the indicator get in the way of landing the fish. I also like to use the non-slip mono-loop, also called the Rapala knot, for those of us who aren't purists, to attach the flies to the leader. I do that. It helps them bounce and look a bit more natural in the still water environment. Fish are a little bit more discerning about that in a lake than they would be in the river. So anything you can do to add more realistic movement to them is going to be a good thing. That's the rig that I would recommend to just about anybody, unless fish are actively eating off the top. You can certainly throw streamers out on lakes, but I personally have just always had more luck with an indicator rigs. That's what I usually default to. I know some guys really get into it with the streamers on lakes. I think it was about a year ago, me and Alex in Berkeley were out on a couple high mountain lakes, and I was fishing an indicator rig, and I was doing okay, and Alex was just pulling a little leech across the bottom, and he was kicking my butt. So some days that is the ticket. It's just, they're mercurial, just like stream trout, to where you just kind of got to figure it out. So definitely employ all of them, but that's the stuff that I'd go with there. And hopefully that answers the question here, Cameron. I hope that I gave you enough information. You feel like you can go out there and be successful in some alpine lakes. And if you need any more info or you have a follow-up, as always, do not hesitate to get in touch with me. I'm here to help, and I love to do it. Thanks again for the question. All right, and our last question, but the show's not over after this because we do have story time coming up, so remember that. Our last question, Parker from Colorado writes in, says, "Hey, Spencer, love the podcast. This is my first summer fly fishing, and I've learned a ton so far. I'm curious about how to take care of my gear. I have a ton of hobbies and love to keep my equipment in top shape. Can you provide recommendations for taking care of my fly rods, reels, flies, etc.? Excuse me. Anything I should do for seasonal storage? Is it okay to leave all of my gear in a hot car for a few days in the summer? Any advice is much appreciated. Thanks." Hey, Parker, thank you for the question. I appreciate it. So I've been really horrible about taking care of my gear at times. I think I shared this story before on the show, but back in the day, I used to leave my waders and my boots in the bed of my truck and then get frustrated when they would start leaking or fall apart because they're sitting there baking in the UV rays all day long, days on end. It's just not good. That's not what you want to have happen. So pro tip number one, do not leave your gear in the bed of your truck all the time. That's not where it belongs. I've also ruined a graphite fly rod once because I put the rod and rod sock away wet. The rod sock being wet was what really did it, but I put both of those away wet, and all that extra moisture, it got into the thread wraps on the rod, and it actually ruined the wraps. Like, they got cloudy and got mildew in them. It was nasty. Plus the reel seat swelled up, so the water got into it and swelled it up so much that the band that you twist the reel seat into, or the reel into, pardon me, that wouldn't even fit over the wood part of the reel seat anymore because the wood had swollen up so much. It really wasn't a cheap fix to get that rod back into game shape either. So I actually even wrote a story about this rod. I've linked it in the podcast description in case you're interested in reading it. But anyways, I have left my gear in trucks over the summer. You should be fine if you do that. You don't want to leave a bamboo rod in a hot truck, but other than that, the rest of your gear should be fine. I mean, don't leave it in there. If it's 120 outside, I'd probably take it out. But if it's just normal summer temps, I think you're going to be okay. Maybe some gear folks who are listening can tell me that, to not do that, but I haven't had any issues with that at this point. Now, all this is to say, though, that it is important to take care of all your gear, not just your waders and your boots. So I'm going to go through what I do for all of my gear so that you've got a good idea of what you can do to make sure you're taking care of your stuff. So fly rods, never, ever put them away wet. Always dry them off. I also like to clean my rods when they get dirty just to keep sand and the rough grit from the dirt off of the finish so that it doesn't scratch the finish. The finish is important. It does help protect the rod, help it last, help it deal with the UV rays. So you want to make sure you're not damaging that finish in any ways. Some folks say that you should wax the ferrules, but I've never needed to on a graphite fly rod. I've never known anybody personally that waxes the ferrules on a graphite rod, so I wouldn't worry about that too much. Now, your reels and your line. Clean your line, people. Do not be me. Do not be the guy who never cleans his fly line. Clean your line. Otherwise, you're going to be buying line way more than you should, because I've got to buy new line already because I never cleaned it and it fell apart before I could save it. It's just not fun. Clean it at least twice a year, more if you fish more often. If you get into a lot of dirt and it's really dirty, clean it after that. You will extend your fly line's life. The same goes for your reel, especially if you set it down in sand or a lot of loose dirt that can work its way into parts of the reel. Most drags these days are fully sealed, so it's not going to be in the drag itself, but it's still a good idea to take it apart, clean it, grease the reel. Like, do that once a year, you're going to be fine. Waders. Okay, I mentioned these a little bit earlier, but make sure you hang them up when you are not using them. All right? Hang them to dry. It is worth it to do that. You just don't want to leave them smushed up too much. If you leave them all rolled up, it can add extra stress to the seams, maybe, which is something you don't want. Then, if they're all rolled up and squished, they're not going to dry all the way either, and that can lead to mildew buildup, which is, I was actually just talking about this with a buddy of mine who works for one of the big wader companies, and that mildew buildup is actually one of the leading causes of wader failure. So you definitely don't want to let the mildew build up. Anyways, hang them to dry, hang them up when you're not using them. It is worth it to clean your waders at least once a year as well. If you fish more than that, then maybe if you fish a lot, probably clean them twice a year. If you fish an average amount, once a year is going to be plenty for you. I do have a wader and boot bag that my waders go in when I'm driving, and I love that because it helps keep the UV rays off of them if they end up in the back of the truck. Again, make sure you avoid that. Your boots, really all you've got to do with these is make sure that they're dry, but mostly just keep them out of the sun as much as possible if you're not wearing them. Don't let them sit in the bed of your truck. Don't be that angler. Don't make my mistakes, all right? And as far as your flies go, really the only thing here is just make sure they don't get wet so that the hooks don't rust. Other than that, you should be fine. And remember, this is kind of the big rule that I think applies to all the stuff. If it can get dirty, clean it. That will help your gear last the longest. So hopefully that answers your question, Parker. If you've got any more follow-up, please let me know. In the meantime, folks, it is time to get ready for what we're all waiting for. Well, at least I am every week. I love it. It is time for story time. Story time this week, I'm going to tell a tale about a little trip that me and Alex in Berkeley took together. It was earlier this year, so early 2023, and it was in the middle of this incredible winter that we had in Utah, or they had. I was living in Wyoming at the time. I still am. Anyways, the winter was incredible in Utah, and incredible in Utah, parts of Wyoming, parts of Colorado. The winter was just incredible. We were actually in Colorado for this little story. We were out there. Yeah, I know. Make the jokes, right? We're in Colorado. Well, we were. The three of us were there, and we enjoyed the heck out of it. But there's this little stream that we found, and to get to it, we had to drive across the top of this big plateau that was at like 8,000 feet. And it had just dumped, I think the week before, it had just dumped like another 2 feet of snow or some ridiculous amount like that. And the road was plowed for some reason. I don't know why, but the road was plowed, and we're driving over this thing. And when I say plowed, I mean they had pushed the snow off to either side in banks that were so tall. They were taller than the truck, were taller than Alex's truck. They were so tall, it was like driving through a Mario Kart circuit. Just one of those ridiculous things that doesn't look real. I was legitimately worried in some spots. They were so tall, I thought the snowbanks were going to collapse and bury the truck. and we'd be stuck with no cell service, and we'd have to explain to everybody how we ended up dying that way, and it wasn't going to be any fun. But luckily, that didn't happen. So we drive through this, and I kid you not, it was about an hour of driving through the Great Wall of Snow, is what it felt like. And we do it, we get down to this river, and we are the only car in the parking lot, which, I mean, if you've been to Colorado before, you know that never happens. You're never the only car in the parking lot in Colorado, or in Utah anymore, for that matter. Anyways, we're out there, and we get rigged up, and it just starts lightly snowing, just enough to bring the bugs out a tiny bit, because this is a little spring creek. So the water is a consistent temperature year round. And I think this is in February, so the midges were still hatching. And we get down into this creek, and it's known for having some good fish. It's known for having some very, very good fish. In fact, I know a fellow who caught a 27-inch rainbow out of this little spring creek. So we were really interested in what we could get into. And we get up in there. We fished this little stream before, and when it gets really pressured, there's a stretch that has a ton of big fish in it. That's where we wanted to fish. But when it's been fished a lot, those big fish just don't even show up. They don't want to come to the party. But we got in there, and we realized that the road that we just driven, the Great Wall of Snow that we just driven through, must have just been recently plowed, because those big fish were out. So they hadn't been fished to for who knows how long. We were in there. We were like the first people who got in when the road got reopened. So it was just really lucky timing on our part. And we get in there, and between me and Alex and Berkeley, I think we both caught 2 or 3 big, like 20+ inch rainbows each. It was incredible. And the snow's falling, and there's midges hatching, and this stream's tiny, and we hook them, and the current's really fast. So I remember one I hooked, and it was a rodeo from the get-go. That fish just turned and burned and shot downstream, and I'm running, I'm hollering, Alex, get the net, I need it. And he's stumbling after me. We're trying not to trip and die, and Berkeley's just like, what's going on? Because he was so far upstream from us, he just heard hollering. And it was just a fun day of just running around. It was like being kids on Christmas all over again, because we got into these just ridiculously fun fish that really, there really is no lesson to this story either. It was a ridiculously fun day. It was worth going out in the sketchy road out there. It was worth the long drive. It was worth the cold. And so I think that's something worth remembering, especially as winter's starting to round back into shape here. It's worth getting out there and experiencing that kind of stuff, because those are the experiences that you're always going to remember. And even now, me and Alex and Berkeley still refer back to that trip, be like, oh yeah, remember that Colorado trip in February? Yeah, that fishing was so good. And the big fish were part of it. That was really fun. But what was really part of it was just we had the whole river to ourselves. It was just lightly snowing. It was quiet. It was so peaceful. And the fishing was just fun. So maybe that's the other lesson to it, is just enjoy the fun that there is out there. It's not always about the fish. They help make it fun, but just enjoy the fun parts of it. All right, folks, that's going to do it for us this week on Untangled. If you ever have any questions about fly fishing, please send them on into the show. I want to get those answered. There's always a link in the podcast description for you to do that. If you can, go ahead and rate and subscribe to this show wherever you're listening to it. That would be huge for us as well. The ratings and subscriptions go a long way to helping this show grow and keeping the lights on here in the podcast studio. And until next week, everybody, get out on the water and tie lines.